Hey there everybody, my name is Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist and welcome back to my channel. Those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I am a licensed therapist. I am also a writer working on my first novel. And on my channel, we like to dig into what I consider to be the heart of writing, the characters. And the heart of the characters is in their psychology. So by exploring psychology of both your world, your characters, your plot, and everything else, you get a much more well-rounded and interesting creation, in my opinion. So today we are on the second to last video on my world building series on culture. And that is, today we're going to tackle what I call the behaviors. So admittedly, this is kind of a catch-all category because there's a lot of areas of culture that don't necessarily fit into a nice little box because that's what makes culture interesting. So this one, let's just dig into just some basic behaviors that people do within a culture that you might want to take into account when you're creating yours. So I think the easiest way to go about this is to just let's start at the beginning of someone's day and just go through it and see what we come up with. So beginning of the day, waking up. What is your culture's cycle? So, what is their sleep rise cycle? As a general rule, we tend to assume that most people fall into the sleep at night, wake up during the day, 24-hour thing that we have here on Earth. Not necessarily true. They have actually done studies where they removed people from the rise and fall of the sun by putting them in these deep caves, and they monitored to see what happened when they had no sunlight to essentially set their clocks. When that happened, they seemed to adjust to, I believe it was a 28-hour day, and instead of having one huge chunk of time where they would work and then sleep, they split it up and they would work and sleep for like 6 to 7 hour increments, and then it would go back and forth like that. So one thing you can consider with your culture is, when do they sleep, when do they work, when do they play? Another thing to consider is, especially if you're doing sci-fi, not every planet has the same cycle that Earth does. In fact, most of them don't have the same cycle. For example, I believe it's Venus. A day on Venus is longer than its year because the universe is weird. So that's something you can take into account. How long is a day in a year on your planet? For my work in progress, the planet of Natu, they have a 27-hour day, and their year is slightly longer than Earth's. It's 425 days. So, how do you determine how long you want a day or a year to be? I mean, it's really kind of up to you. When I was taking it into account, I didn't want it to be too different from Earth's, but I wanted it to be different enough that I could do some fun stuff with it. So that's how I got my numbers. If you're interested in figuring out character ages and things like that, you might have to go back to some basic math class and do some ratios. I'll admit I had to call somebody to help me with that because I hate math and math hates me, but I think it was useful for making a more interesting world, so that's something to take into account. The other thing is, for example, my Jagreen, they live underground. They don't have a sun or a moon. They don't have that to control their work and sleep cycle. So they have their own. They've set up their own. That's some behaviors to take into account when you're coming up with a culture. Second, let's say, so what's the next thing we do generally when we get up? We usually eat breakfast or shower or something like that. does your world have an understanding of hygiene? Is hygiene important? I think when we're doing most modern stories, we tend to go with, yes, they have access to showers and plumbing and things like that. But that wasn't always the case. Um, and I think a lot of fantasy stories choose to avoid this entirely. And I get why, because we don't need to know details about necessarily how in depth your plumbing is or things like that. But is hygiene important? I think that's an interesting aspect of culture to consider. Um, it used to be in the Middle Ages you couldn't take a bath unless you had a doctor's note for a brief period of time. In ancient Greece, they used oil, and they would scrape off the dirt and the oil. Um, in in European history, we've had periods where people would share bath water, things like that. So those are things to just take into account. I mean, like I said, with everything that we mention here, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to put it in, but sometimes it's nice to know. Let's see. Eating. How many meals do your people eat? When do they eat them? Do they eat them with family? Do they eat them by themselves? This one I think is interesting because meal times, especially in more modern societies, seem to be where people have a chance to kind of talk and converse and make plans and discuss their days with one another. But there's different ways that this can happen. When I was in school, they referred to them as you either had the badminton method or you had the bowling method. And what that means is in some cultures, when you sit down together and you have a meal, they converse with the bowling method, which is essentially one person has the floor. They speak their mind. They say everything that's on their mind. Nobody interrupts them. Nobody chimes in, gives their own opinion. The person says what they want to say, and then they're done. Then it moves on to the next person. That's the bowling method of conversation. Then you have what we call the badminton or the tennis method, which is what most people think of, I think, when they're considering conversation at a dinner table, which is one person talks, another person chimes in with their thoughts, and they go back and forth. So there isn't ever just one person that has the floor. There's just happens to be one person speaking at a time. That's something to take into account. Let's see, work and school. I didn't do a whole video on economy because I am not good at math, and I'm not going to give you guys bad advice. So, but something to consider though is work and school. Is school required? What type of schooling is there? Does it vary by the class? So, for example, within my different cultures, you have the Dragrim, and they have required schooling until like our equivalent of high school / college. And at that point, they actually have a ceremony where the person essentially has to win over mentors in whatever field they're striving for to win the ability to continue training under them and win an apprenticeship, essentially. Then you have the Natu, who for the most part provide free schooling to all their children because they view education is very important. Now, how that education is given to them varies. Generally, each clan has a teacher or tutor or whatnot. It may vary within the larger cities. Within the Natula, who live up in the icy north, it's usually done within families because there isn't a lot of huge cities. So it can vary vastly depending on the environment. Let's see. Third, how do your characters greet and say goodbye to each other? This might be kind of a weird thing to think about because I think it's one of those things we're all so used to we don't think about it. I'm from the United States, so generally when you're meeting somebody brand new in the United States, you usually extend your hand for a handshake. That's something that we're raised to think, okay, you want to have a solid handshake, you need to be firm, you need to look them in the eye. That's what we're raised with. But that's not universally true. Some cultures, they don't have eye contact because it's considered disrespectful. Some cultures, you don't touch anybody who is of the opposite gender of you. So all that plays into these behaviors of how we greet one another. Another thing, I've actually been chiming in on videos from some of my friends that live over in the UK, and so I'm sure you guys will correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that seems to be repeated over and over is when people from the UK come to America, they're a little astounded by how I'll say upfront and friendly we tend to be. And by that I mean when we greet someone, we don't just say hello. We you just say hi, how was your day? We introduce ourselves, that kind of thing. In some countries, that's weird. That's considered very weird. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about how your culture greets one another. And this takes into account kind of your culture's overall values. Like I know we mentioned before in the values video, but just something to keep in mind. But to remember too that it's going to vary across your classes, across your different regions, things like that. So, maybe in one region it's normal to be very open and friendly and approachable, and another it's not. So, little tidbits to keep in mind. Let's see here. What's another one? Oh, personal space. This is a big one. That actually, even as a counselor, I try to get a feel for this when I first meet somebody. So basically, personal space is how close does someone have to get to you before you become uncomfortable. Lots of things can affect this. How you were raised is definitely one. Religious beliefs can be one. Just personal preference, like some people they feel more comfortable when they have more room. Others vice versa. Trauma has a big effect on this. Good example is when I was working in the hospital, we had an individual who was very friendly, always wanted to be involved, always was hugging people and wanting to shake hands and things like that. However, he repeatedly asked, do not touch him or approach him from behind because of his trauma. And that's something else to take into account with your characters, is what is normal in their culture and do they follow that? Because some people don't. Just because an overall culture tends to be very open and friendly doesn't mean your character necessarily has to be. So there's that. Let's see here. We talked about clothing in the other videos and things like that. So let's see. We kind of discussed what your characters kind of do for fun. And that's something to kind of consider as you go along is their leisure time considered normal, or are they seen kind of weird? Is leisure time even agreed upon? Is it frowned on in your culture? Some cultures, they put very strong emphasis on work and producing results and things like that. Some cultures, they say no, you need to have a balance. Some cultures say no, we should just be free from labor and things like that. So there's a very wide spectrum of what you can do. And I think the more you mix it up, the more interesting it is. So my stonemen in my story are very much product-based results. They value hard work. They value people that put in extra time, things like that. Then you have the Natuba, who are on the opposite end of the spectrum, in that they don't necessarily believe that there should be quote-unquote careers or things like that. There's things that you'd like to pursue and there's things you like to learn, but the whole purpose of life is to just explore. So there isn't a ton of emphasis on work or making products. And for that reason, their economy is still usually strictly barter. They don't really use coinage or anything like that. And then you have other races that fall in between the two extremes. So that's something to wonder about. Let's see. Transportation. I'm not going to go into big detail on that. I mean, that's kind of how do characters get around? Do they walk? Do they use horses or other animals? Is it feasible to travel long distances? Is it feasible not? That kind of thing. Um, let's see. Like I said, I'm not going to go in depth in economy because I don't think that I am equipped to talk very much about that. However, I will bring up that bear in mind that some of the things that we consider to be modern are not necessarily as modern as we think. The first banks, for instance, cropped up around the Crusades. So consider that. Um, okay, here's one that's fun. Is how do parents and children interact? And by that I mean, is there a belief that children have an equal say? Is there a belief that children should obey the authority of the parent? That kind of thing. And how do you display that? In some cultures, it would be the child doesn't speak unless they're spoken to. In some cultures, it would be the child is allowed to intervene and add their input in a conversation. Some cultures depends on what the conversation is. There's lots of different factors. Um, so let's see. And like I said, this is kind of a catch-all of everything except history, because history, I'm doing the next culture video. That will be the last one on culture as of right now. And I'm saving that one for last because there's a lot to talk about in that one. So, but to kind of sum up this video, I mean, these are things like, that's why I say let's just take a day and run through it. You know, what are things you do throughout the day? And think about, have I thought about how my characters might do this? Does this apply to my characters? The other night I was actually thinking about, oh, how do my characters go to sleep? Do they tell one another good night? Do parents tell their children stories? Is it done around a campfire? How do they sleep? Because in Western societies, we have this idea of, you know, the children sleep with the parent only when they're very little, generally. Obviously, varies kind of like everything. But then as the children go older, they sleep on their own. This isn't universally true. And honestly, we didn't even really start doing it till a couple centuries ago. I mean, it used to be you would sleep in a communal bed because that's where it was warm and you didn't have a lot of money to buy separate beds because bedding was expensive. So, other things to consider. Um, let's see. Are there any beliefs in protection or things like that that families do at night? Like, for instance, I know in traditional Orthodox Jewish culture, there used to be almost a ritual where the parent would cover the child's eyes at night before they put them to sleep, and it was to protect them from the evil eye, essentially. So, are there any beliefs or behaviors like that your characters do? And I say beliefs or behaviors because let's be honest, sometimes we do things and we really don't know why we do them. We just know this is how people have always done it, and so that's how we do it. So, there's that. Um, and I think that's kind of where I want to end this is just there's such a mishmash of different behaviors that you can consider. And I think the best way to go about it is, like I said, to run through a character day and apply it to your day and see what areas that you maybe haven't thought about. Because I think you'll probably find quite a few that just haven't occurred to you. And that's okay. Like I said, some of these you're not going to put in your story, but I think they're important to at least think about. Like if you think about it, you're like, okay, this isn't necessarily going to fit in my story. I don't think it's important. It's not going to come up. I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, that's fine. Because you're never going to fit all the aspects of culture into a story. There's just so many of them. But at least you can say, you know, I considered it. I thought about it. And I think just the act of thinking about it and considering it and researching it all automatically gives you a step up from some others. Okay, guys, so that was my mishmash video of essentially everything else I could think of. that falls under culture. I'm not claiming I hit everything. In fact, I'm almost positive I missed some big things. But I think that just throwing out there the idea that there's always going to be things you're going to miss, there's always going to be things that you're going to think about later, and that's okay. Just the idea that you put some thought into it and you consider it, and then you see what you come up with, and that's fun. So I thank you guys for chiming in and listening to me ramble on in this video. As always, I put up new videos every Thursday and every Sunday, and I hope I will see you guys in the next video. If you guys enjoy this content, please make sure to leave a comment or a suggestion below. I always love to read through them. And if you click that bell and subscribe, you'll know whenever I upload a new video so you don't miss any. And until next time, have a good one.